There are numerous, nearly infinite amounts of ways to orchestrate a few bars. At any given moment, it can be very challenging to know what you want each instrument to do, if anything at all. And it can also be challenging to adapt the orchestra into certain moods and atmospheres. I've composed 4 bars of simple accompaniment material and orchestrated it at 5 different levels, or sizes. Each of these levels is unique in its color and timbre, with each one incorporating a different section of the orchestra, but they all maintain the same musical atmosphere. Today I'd like to share with you how I incorporated different sections of the orchestra while keeping a consistent mood. Let's hop on over to Sibelius so I can show you what I did. Okay, so here we are in Sibelius, and this is kind of the first level here. And so this is just the low strings, the viola, cellos, and bass. And the first thing I kind of want to say about that is that you think of orchestration as like how you assign all these roles to all these different instruments, but it's important to remember that even sparse textures like this are still valid. They're still part of the process. And in fact, I think, most pieces, there are a lot of pieces in the canon that would do well to have some sections that are sort of this size rather than, using the whole orchestra all the time. But in any case, let's just listen to this real quick and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so basically, this is a really, really simple kind of accompaniment. You've got basically just a figuration of an A flat major chord, or rather an A flat major 7 chord, because there are G's in here as well. You will notice occasionally like that second note in the viola or this note in the cello. Basically, the bass is holding down the tonic as well as the most important part of the beat, and then the violas and cellos are basically just bouncing off of that. This is a really common way to figure this type of thing, and to sort of keep it interesting, you can have them sort of change range, change where they are on the chord, just to keep it a little less stale. And I get kind of like a woodsy vibe from this, and kind of the goal here, I may have mentioned in the intro, I actually haven't recorded that yet, but kind of the goal here is to maintain sort of the same atmosphere throughout the different sizes of orchestration. And so I kind of want to maintain this sort of mysterious, misty kind of feeling throughout all of those. So that is the first level there. Very, very simple low string accompaniment. So where are the violins? The violins are in this level 2 here, which is the full string orchestra. And instead of just having them, sort of do the same type of thing that the violas and cellos are doing and have them be on the pits, I decided to go with something more sustained. And so one element of having sustained notes in an accompaniment, to kind of just make it feel a little bit more lively, I've added these dynamic markings, right? There's just a little swell there. And that's just so that, there's motion to it. It's not just like they're static sitting there. The top players of the first violins are changing from a C to a D, which kind of adds like a nice sharp 11 flavor to the chord. Just a little bit of tension, but not really needing to go anywhere specific. But yeah, like I was sort of saying, it's perfectly valid to have the violins do what the viola and cello are doing as well. It's perfectly fine to have the entire string section function as sort of one role. But I thought this just this type of accompaniment was able to be a little bit more diverse. Now, if it were more bombastic, if it were more lively, or perhaps more abrasive, then I would say having the full string section do kind of more or less the same thing can be really good, especially if you wanted to do pizzicato, because if you're at a louder dynamic level, pizzicato definitely needs more support than something like this. So that is level 2. Let's go ahead and give it a little listen. So yeah, you can kind of hear that adding the violins in a sustained way with that little swell is, it's subtle, but it adds a lot compared to just pizzicato, and especially with kind of the note choices there as well. Having the D in the top of the first violins definitely makes it, a little bit more tense rather than just sort of floating on a tonic chord, right? So that's level 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at level 3, and we're adding the percussion here. And so the first thing I want to say about this is that you shouldn't be afraid of certain instruments going out of their sort of cliche comfort zones, if that makes sense. A lot of the time when I was, starting out writing orchestral music, I really didn't like writing for percussion. And we'll talk about this with brass too, because it's sort of a similar thing. But I really, really didn't like writing for percussion because I didn't really know how. And also I was like, oh, percussion, that's really for the bombastic stuff. That's for the crazy orchestral music, for the, like Mahler, Brahms, big orchestral, full orchestral music. And I really liked to write, more subdued kind of music. I really like to write very sparsely, and I like to write a lot of quiet, kind of nature-inspired orchestral music. That was kind of what I was into. It's kind of still what I'm into now. But there is always a way that you can kind of fit instruments into the context. So, for example, I have a snare drum here, right? This snare line. It's not just for military music, right? You can add a little something to any kind of texture with pretty much any instrument. Obviously there are cases where it's like not really worth it to try and figure it out, or it's just like, that timbre is just not what you want. But obviously for the sake of this, we're going from the ground up. We're going from, just a few string sections to the full orchestra. So I kind of wanted to demonstrate how I would involve instruments that I wouldn't typically use in these sorts of contexts. But, when I'm sort of forcing myself to do so, what that kind of looks like and how that's possible. The next thing I want to talk about is that this is very much variable, how much of the percussion section you use for any given thing. I thought that this was a really good combination of instruments for this particular atmosphere, but you don't have to, conform to this. Obviously, it's just going to depend on the context. And I definitely wouldn't pressure yourself to use a wide array of percussion instruments all at once, all the time, because that's just kind of overwhelming in the context of like an orchestral setting, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then pretty basic stuff for, like the timpani here. That's just every other bar as opposed to every single bar. The contrabass is, every 2 beats, and I thought, having the marimba double that is fine, but we probably shouldn't do that, with every bass instrument. So for the timpani, and you'll also notice the left hand of the harp, those are spaced out further, and that's just something you can do with doubling to make it so that the parts aren't exact clones of each other, right? And then the glockenspiel here, this is actually why I, wanted to say what I said previously, because you could do perfectly fine in this texture without the glockenspiel. But I kind of thought of it. I was like, oh, that might be nice, but it would work perfectly fine without it too. So, it's just kind of, it's just a case by case thing where you kind of want to feel it out. And with the percussion section, you have a lot of freedom. to pick and choose your instruments. And then one noteworthy thing, again, the snare drum that I've involved here is doing a completely unique rhythm. It's not a rhythm that was in the previous two levels. That's another great thing that the percussion section can kind of add. Not that other instruments can't do, unique rhythms, but I feel like I feel that it works really well for the snare drum. Yeah, so that's kind of what I did with that. I did involve the swell because it was getting a little bit drowned out. That wouldn't happen in real life, but for the sake of this, I want it to be audible in Sibelius. And then the last thing I want to point out is if we scroll down a little bit, the right hand of the harp here. So this is doubling the violas and the cellos, but not exactly. It's sort of the same thing I was talking about with the contrabass doubling the left-hand harp and the timpani. The rhythms aren't exactly the same, and it's just kind of punctuating. It has the pickup, and then it's punctuating beats 2 and 4. So instead of bum, 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 it's going bum, 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 right? So that just kind of makes it so that, again, it's not an exact clone, and the unique timbre of the harp is only coming in certain spots rather than, the whole time. I don't know. I think it often can kind of obscure the purpose of having instruments double each other when you have them double each other exactly. Like, obviously, there are going to be a lot of instances where that's totally fine and appropriate even. But there are also instances where if you're doubling something exactly, it's kind of, I don't know, it feels lazy, and it also feels like, well, what's really the point? Like, I don't know. Again, that's only sometimes, but that's something that I felt in this context. So let's go ahead and give this a listen, and I will pull this up to the percussion, because you know what the strings look like, so that we can kind of see that. So yeah, that's the third level with strings and percussion. It's kind of an interesting combination there to just have the percussion section and not any of the winds. I also forgot to point out that I'm kind of lumping in the harp with the percussion section, just because that's how I tend to write for harp, is kind of as a member of that section, as well as the piano. I don't have a piano here, but that's kind of usually the case in terms of how I think of the different families of instruments. Obviously, if that is not the case for you, then that is very cool, Kanye. And yeah. So moving on to level 4 here, we have got the strings, percussion, and now we're adding the woodwinds. And so the first thing I'll point out is, again, sort of a new rhythm, but not one like the snare drum. That's kind of a unique thing. This one is just a constant quarter note pulse in the flutes and oboes. And that originally was doubled from the second violins and first violins. The first violins are thrown up an octave, I think. And I was like, okay, that's, well, how can we make that a little bit more interesting, a little bit more purposeful? And so I thought having them sort of dovetail a quarter note line, not into each other, but there is a constant quarter note pulse through the two flutes and the two oboes. That is kind of cool. So I'm actually just going to play the two of these isolated real quick so we can hear that. Yeah, I really like that sound, and I feel like it actually adds something to the texture rather than just doubling whole notes. So if that's something that maybe you're getting stuck with in terms of, when you're doubling violins in high woodwinds, maybe that's something you can think about, is just adding a really basic rhythm to sort of keep it interesting. Sort of doing a similar thing in the clarinets. And actually, I think this is really cool. This is one of my favorite doublings, is the clarinets and the harp. The clarinets are sort of doing what the harp is doing, which is inspired obviously by these beats 2 and 4 of the violas and cellos. Obviously, it's adjusted in the harp, like I was talking about earlier, with the rhythms and the octaves. And so that's sort of the same thing that's going on here, except the clarinets don't have the pickups. And the reason that this is one of my favorite doublings is that it's really, really subtle, but it works really, really well to sustain the harp. So if you have any kind of harp chord and you're able, range permitting, to double that in the clarinets, it works really well to sustain the harp notes or the harp sound a little bit longer. And it's kind of an illusion, really. You don't really necessarily even notice that it's the clarinets, but that's something that I really like. And that's kind of why I have these accents on these notes too, is because it kind of mimics that sort of sharp fall off. When you pluck a string, the dynamic level of that is a very steep drop off after you pluck it. And so I kind of want to imitate that in the winds. Then the bassoon's pretty straightforward. Second bassoon is doubling the contrabass an octave up, and then the first bassoon is doubling the cellos rather. And that's basically that. So let's listen to that whole thing together, and I'll just stay up here on these woodwinds so you can see them. So that was just another layer. And, my mental image of this whole thing, all 5 of these is kind of a woodsy thing. And so, obviously the woodwind timbre is just really great for that. So let's go on to level 5, which this is the full orchestra. So now we're adding the brass. And so I want to just reiterate here, don't be afraid of the brass. If you're writing quiet music, there is a way for them to be involved, even if it's not what they do best, which is, belting out the beginning of Tchaikovsky 4 or those big B flat minor chords in Shasti 5, that sort of stuff. There's always a way to involve an instrument in whatever context. Again, maybe it's not always worth it. Maybe you just don't like the timbre, but it is possible. And so all that is to say that don't condemn an instrument to resting just because you feel like that's not what they're supposed to be doing. It's always worth considering, right? You don't have to do it. Just, think about it. And so you got a couple interesting things here. The most basic of which is the low brass. We haven't had any sustain in the lower range of the orchestra yet. We've only had the violins and the flutes and oboes doing any kind of sustaining. So, other than the like marimba and plucked instruments, I suppose, but I don't really count that because, again, sort of what I was talking about with, sustaining really in my mind is more in these wind and string instruments. And so now we've involved the low brass to bring some warmth to the low end of the orchestra with these just really nice A flat major 7 chords. Again, with the C moving up to the D, there's parallel octaves there. I really don't care. Maybe that's something you care about, something to think about. I'm just not a person that cares about that. And the tuba doubling the contrabass is, again, really, really straightforward. I put some staccato dots on it to sort of mimic the Pitts sound. And then up in the horns, we're actually supporting that snare rhythm. Since it's getting a little thicker, it's kind of nice to sort of justify that a little bit more. Instead of having the snare be all by itself, we're adding the horns on that snare rhythm just to kind of beef it up a bit. And it's just on again A flat major 7. And yeah, that's also pretty straightforward. Then the last thing here is the trumpets. And so this is the most sort of brazen part of this, namely this G. And so what I've done here is I've sort of doubled the oboes. I really do like the trumpet and oboe doubling, especially with the trumpets being muted. I think that's something that's really cool. And so I've removed the sustain though, because that's a little overboard in terms of the sound for me, is listening to the trumpets kind of swell up on the whole notes there with the mutes. So I add them in just right here instead of back here. And so it's the second trumpet starting out. And then you would mark this in the part, but the first trumpet is muted as well, not just the second one. But yeah, the second trumpet comes in here on this nice thing, and then the G kind of comes out of nowhere. Like I said, it's the most brazen. It's the most kind of ear pulling thing that we've had, the most attention grabbing thing that we've had in any of these. So maybe it's not what you want for your accompaniment, and that's totally fine. But for this, I think it's okay to have something that sort of stands out. It's never, you don't want to detract from a melody that might be happening over your accompaniment. Maybe the trumpets are the melody. I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't hurt to have melodic motion in accompanimental instruments. Not necessarily a counterline, but just something that sort of is a commentary on an extant melody. Obviously, in these instances, we don't have any. There's no melody. This is all hypothetical. So yeah, this high G kind of pulls the ear away, but in this context, I think that's all right. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's give this a listen, and I will focus on the brass. So yeah, that's obviously much more involved, much more active, much more colorful than the first one, right? The pizzicato low strings. But again, there is certainly a place for this. So, I'm not saying that any of these are better than any other, but they're just different contexts, right? Personally, I love this type of thing. I love the really sparse orchestration, but it's not something that, you should necessarily have all the time. And so it's good to have sort of other options, other ways of thinking about orchestrating something, even if it's like this, where it's just the same 4 bars of accompaniment, having sort of different mental visions for that type of thing can be helpful when composing. And again, you can kind of mix and match these things. It's not like, oh, if I have the strings and I want to add an oboe, I have to add all of the woodwinds, or if I want to do the strings and a percussion instrument, well, I have to have the strings and the percussion, but I can't have something from a wind family. No, you can really just pick and choose. And that's kind of what makes orchestration really fun, is kind of figuring out what things you like to double and kind of picking and choosing those things. Obviously, in this instance, in this presentation of this video, this is very much done in a sort of blocky way, where it's just, okay, here's the strings of percussion, we're adding the woodwinds, adding the brass. But that was just sort of to demonstrate the different ways of thinking about the different sections in terms of like their entire families rather than individual instruments. And I just think that's a more straightforward way to present this video. Obviously, again, there are way more creative ways to do this, but I think for the purpose of the video, it's the most straightforward thing that I can sort of present here. But yeah, so I hope that was helpful, or at least interesting. But if you're still watching, I really, really appreciate that. We'll be back next week for another orchestration minute. And yeah, I'm trying to reach 900 subscribers by November. So if you could help me out with that, I'd very, very much appreciate it. So thank you very, very much, and I will see you next week.